I'm just delighted to have on the Client Conversation podcast my friend Rudy Rodriguez, who I've known for many years. We actually, I think, started in Dallas, what was then Big Law. We didn't realize it wasn't all that big and by today's standards, but we started around the same time. Rudy is the Executive Vice President, Chief Legal Officer and Human Resources Officer, Corporate Secretary at CEC Entertainment. We'll get into that in a bit. His experience with that during a particularly difficult time for one of CEC's brands, known to probably a lot of listeners as Chuck E. Cheese. I think many of us who are parents have hosted a party or two there. Not Rudy's only stop as in-house counsel. Worked at American Eagle as general counsel, worked at J.C. Penney's, so he's well known to having the role of GC, and then worked at the great, what is now Loch Lord, but Loch Liddell back in the day in Dallas in the 1990s, and this is going to be a great conversation. Like I said, I've known Rudy for a long time. Our sons overlapped on the St. Mark's baseball team together. Rudy's father-in-law was one of my really dear friends and mentors, as was his mother-in-law. And try not to get emotional when we talk about them and anything else that we get into, because Rudy and I are both, we can wear our heart on our sleeves. So anyway, I'd like to jump in, Rudy. Thank you for doing this, first of all.
Absolutely.
I'd like to jump in because it's such an interesting story. It was covered by the Texas Law Book, but it's the, COVID hits. And, many of us were impacted greatly, both health-wise and otherwise. But professionally, this was a stress test for you because, Chuck E. Cheese primarily derives its revenue, CEC Entertainment, from people coming into the restaurant and eating, and they couldn't do that during COVID. So talk a bit about what that experience was like being at the helm and a top executive at CEC.
Right. Well, thanks, Craig. I appreciate the invitation. I'm looking forward to this conversation as well. So I started here at CEC in 2014, and in the beginning of 2020, just after the year began, we had a change at our CEO position. So we started our new CEO just at Martin Luther King Day 2020. Things were going well. We had a good plan in place. We were ready to go. And then COVID hit, started getting rumblings about it at the end of February and started to worry about it at the beginning of March. CEO asked me to lead the task force to respond to COVID operationally and within the company. And so got a bunch of folks involved in that from all areas of the company and all around the country, just trying to understand what we were going to have to do. None of us had ever done this before, of course, so we were all kind of feeling our way. And we started meeting every single day. Before long, it was every day trying to understand what we needed to do to adapt and to try to prepare our restaurants, our locations for what might happen and how to keep our employees and our guests safe. Started interacting and got in touch with a bunch of other GCs at local area restaurant brands that I've gotten to know over the years, and so we started comparing notes and trying to figure out things. And this was before any protocols had been suggested, before any restrictions had been imposed. But then, we had to shut down when everybody else did. We had to shut down all the locations around the country. That was over 500, close to 600 when you take into account our second brand, Peter Piper Pizza, which is based primarily in the Southwest. And we had to figure out what we were going to do next. We had very casual, basically, relationships with third-party delivery services already, but really was just a fraction of our revenues. It was not something that it was really trying to be an incremental addition to what we might get in any given year. But that suddenly became all we had. And it was quickly apparent that it wasn't enough. So we had to start working on a carry-out business, which we had never done at the big brand at Chuck E. Cheese. People, the only carry-out people traditionally did was when they didn't finish their pizza, took it with them on the way home. And so we started to provide a carry-out business. And one of the things that we did early on when we had to shut down all the locations was we had to furlough almost all our employees. And it was really a tough situation, but we had to let all of them go to unpaid leave around the country. And so one of the things that we did, the CEO was very strong. My CEO is David McKillips, and he's very strong in people relationships and was very committed to communication, wanted to make sure that we kept in touch with everybody and let them know how things were going every step of the way. And so once we had to furlough everybody by the late March, we started a cadence of communications Monday, Wednesday, Friday to let people know what we were doing, what we knew, what we didn't know, what we were waiting for. And it quickly became apparent to us, well, not quickly, but over the few weeks that followed, that this was not going to be a short-term thing. I mean, when we first let people go, we said we'd hope to get them back in a couple of weeks. And that didn't happen. And then a month passed and then another few weeks, and it just continued and continued. And I can keep going, but that was when things were really at their worst. We were shut down completely all the way into May. We retained the general managers at each of the locations and one or two other senior level assistant managers just to keep the business that we had, which was very small. I mean, we were in the double digits of revenues for several weeks in a row there. That was just ridiculous in terms of our revenues were down to almost nothing. But we wanted to keep those GMs employed, keep them paid, because anybody who's in the restaurant industry knows the GM is the most important position in the company, because they keep if their stores are successful, that's how your company makes money, and you want to keep them as happy as you can. So we kept them on board, and they stayed on throughout the pandemic. We never let any of them go, even as other folks were coming in and out. So that's where we were through the first quarter and into the second quarter of 2020. And then, then we had to make some other decisions.
Yeah. So it strikes me, you mentioned the quality of your CEO, David, being good with people. I happen to know, you might not say this about yourself, but you're terrific with people. I just finished a book by Kim Scott. Maybe you've read, Radical Candor, who some of my GC friends recommended to me. Talk a little bit about how you came into some of those difficult conversations, how you connected with people so that they would understand what was going on and would hopefully be available to the company after their unpaid leave period was done.
Right. Well, one of the things that we did was we told everybody, I mean, here at the Corporate Support Center in Irving, we had to let almost everybody go as well, except for just a few. We were on a skeleton crew, and those of us who were still in the office were just working very long hours. Obviously, everybody was at home and for the first time working at home, trying to figure that thing out, trying to figure out, new video call systems and everything like that.
We still are.
Exactly. One thing that we did was not only did I send out an email to every employee in the company 3 times a week, but I also called my furloughed employees every week at first, and then every other week, just to give them updates. And those were very difficult conversations, just because obviously the employees really wanted to come back. They wanted, some certainty, some understanding of how long this was going to last, and we couldn't provide that. And I just had to tell them we are doing everything we can to to bring the revenues back. We are, thinking of different ways to do that. We're keeping our eyes on this new CARES Act legislation and what it might be able to do for our people and for the company. And we will do everything we can. And it was just, the same kind of thing over and over, week after week, where I really couldn't provide much news, but had to just say, I wish that we could do more for you. And I wish I could give you more information than what I am doing right now. But as the weeks progressed and the CARES Act did come into play, then I had to understand unemployment provisions of every state, because there were enhanced unemployment benefits, trying to understand how we could maximize the benefits available to our people and make sure that they understood the resources, where they could go. So we provided 50 state, not 50 state, but every state where we're in, 47 out of 50. We provided information to our employees on who to call, the unemployment offices, and also what their benefits were in their states. If they had questions, they could call us or they could call the state. And it was just a Herculean task of the few of us who were working it here at the office. It was really trying to keep our folks going as long as possible. Unfortunately, as we got into May, we determined that we weren't going to be able to extend this furlough indefinitely, and we needed to just bite the bullet and lay off people. And so that's what we did. Just a tremendous layoff, and that was very difficult. And these were layoffs without any severance. We didn't have any money to pay any kind of severance. We just continued, though, to communicate to people even after they were laid off. And then, some we did keep on furlough, but some we did lay off. And so it was a terrible situation. It was a lot of pain and difficulty and stress for everybody involved. And then in May, in June, on June 24th, I want to say, is when we finally decided we declared bankruptcy. We filed for bankruptcy protection in federal court in Houston. And that was another process that I had never been through before, but obviously it was very necessary, and it turned out to be the best thing for the company in the long run. But it's always difficult to be on the chief legal position when your company it needs to go into bankruptcy.
Yeah. Well, I hear over communication, humility, empathy, giving people real tools. Those are some incredible takeaways that I know, look, we're not done with crises. Now we're dealing with inflation and supply chain issues, including labor issues. So, it's interesting to me, your history as a general counsel is the retail side of the world, right? It's American Eagle, right. It's JCPenney, it's CEC. What attracts you to that industry, which by the way is the most vulnerable industry to some of these situations that happen? Tell me.
Customer facing. Yeah, consumer facing businesses is what I've been involved with. I started at American Airlines for a few years before I was moved into the GC position at Eagle. And I just love first of all, I love working for brands that everybody knows. You don't have to explain, what we do or what our product is. I love, even when there's criticism of our brand, it still keeps it interesting. We have to deal with occasional PR storms, and that's part of the deal. You can't fly under the radar when you work at Chuck E. Cheese or when you work at American Airlines or, I was at American Eagle when 9/11 happened, and I feel like all of those of us who were at American or United that day, have a different experience than a lot of the country outside of New York or DC. It was an unbelievably difficult experience for all of the all of the families of the employees of those companies that day, obviously. And then, same thing at JCPenney when I was there for a couple of years before I came here, 12 of 13 and left in 14. And that was, JCPenney was having some very difficult times financially at that time. Ultimately, it took a few more years for them to declare bankruptcy, but they did. But they were on their way while I was there. And, so there was a lot of difficult news about that. But you feel a lot of pride when you're a part of a company that has a reputation and a history and a legacy, as all three of the brands I've worked for have. You feel that you have a shared experience with a lot of people, both present and past. It makes it exciting to work. I love what I do. I love the brands that I've worked for, and being a part of a brand like Chuck E. Cheese is just an enormously satisfying experience 98% of the time. And so it's just very fun, to work for companies that have missions of service to the consumer like these is very satisfying and very enriching and rewarding.
So how do you, I happen to have been at the same firm. Hell, I've been going to the same office building for 32 years. It's kind of ridiculous.
I just can't imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Crazy. But, as I tell people, it's like been a lot of different careers within the same 32 years. And, look, it hasn't all been rosy like with your career. Talk a little bit about tools you use to separate you from the result, that this wasn't you. You didn't pick COVID. You didn't pick 9/11. But yet you had to have a lot of difficult conversations that took a lot out of you. I always think of when I had those kind of conversations, I thought of the guy in the Green Mile who would help people, but then the flies would come out of his mouth. Talk a little bit about how you personally got through the pain of these hard calls, these hard communications.
Well, Craig, it takes family, really. I couldn't have done it by myself in any respect. And I have an amazing wife, wonderful kids, but really my wife is she's my rock, and she's been there for me in all of these difficult times. And so, both at 9/11 time when we had young children, as well as, in 2020, I said last year because time flies. It's not last year anymore, thankfully. But she was dealing with it too. She's with the city attorney's office, and she has lots and lots of difficult situations. So we bounce ideas off each other, and we are kind of each other's best career counselors and career coaches. We try to be. I think she's a lot better at it than I am. But I just you can't let yourself just show the difficulty that it's extracting from you with the people you work with all the time. But you can at home, and so that's what we did. When I had particularly, I had some very difficult conversations and situations during 2020, and I would inevitably, just go find my wife, and we just talk about it and try to, go outside, get our minds off it for a little while, hug or whatever it might be. It was just tough. We all went through it, but I couldn't have done it without her. Yeah.
Well, I've known her longer than you, and I couldn't echo that. I knew her when she was, a younger, much, back when we were all young. And, pivoting a little bit from that, because we could talk about Stacy for hours and how much I think about her. Grace and Jimmy won the grandparents lottery, and, in exhibit 246 of why I think you and I might have been separated at birth, although I grew up in Dallas, you grew up near Corpus Christi. in a small town. I mean, but somehow there are all these little data points. And the more I did my research for this, which, when you're just friends, you don't do research on your friends, but when you do a podcast, you have to. I knew of your admiration for your dad. I knew he was a teacher. I didn't know he was a history teacher. My dad, his second life was getting his master's at SMU in history and amassing the largest Teddy Roosevelt private collection in the world. So he was, just always had history books around him. And I'm sure your dad did too. And so talk a little bit about your dad, how he influences the person you become, the leader you become. And in particular, talk a little bit about how you lean on history to influence who you are and the decisions you make.
Wow. Well, that's not a broad question or anything, but I'll do my best.
Just take it however you want.
Well, actually, my father and mother are both from South Texas. My dad's from Corpus Christi. My mom was from the border, Mercedes, Texas, right by Edinburgh. And for those who know the Valley, and my father-in-law, as you may know, was raised in McAllen and went to McAllen High, although none of his kids were born or raised down there. They all were North Texans. But my dad, he did start as a history teacher, and I was born in Denton, Texas, north of Corpus. But we got out of there pretty quickly, and we were following him around while he got his degrees. He had a bachelor's when I was born, and then we went up to Central Michigan University. We lived in Flint, where my middle sister was born, and we lived there for a couple of years while he got his master's. And then we came down to Fort Worth, and by that point, what he got his master's in was bilingual education. And he was an education professor for the rest of his life. And so we moved down to Fort Worth. He started the first bilingual education program in Fort Worth in 1972. I was a first grader at that time and in the first bilingual education class in Fort Worth. And that was fun. I used to run around telling my classmates that my dad was boss of the schools, even though he was just director of a particular program. And so that was great. And then we moved to Albuquerque, where he went to UNM and got his PhD in education as well. And so, again, with a concentration on bilingual education and teacher training. So his whole life has been dedicated to education, and particular bilingual education, and putting teachers out in the community who can help, bring along kids whose first language isn't English. Yeah. And so that was his passion. And one thing
my sister-in-law's a beneficiary of that. She's a Spanish teacher at a heavily bilingual school in Dallas in the DISD.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, he's got thousands of students who still consider him to be, a hero, and so do I. So he retired some years ago, but he's still very active up in Denton. And we went to Denton in 1975. He became a professor, assistant professor at Texas Women's University. And so we were there throughout my junior high school, and they still live there. And so we are, I've been a North Texas kid since 1975, not counting my first grade in Fort Worth as well. What I would say about my dad and his influence is just he's got so many great qualities, but one of them has always been his passion for his profession and for the service. And he believed very strongly that he was put on this earth to serve his community, his family, and his people. And so he was tremendously passionate. I mean, my dad, we all joke with him. He's like the absent-minded professor. I mean, formal socks with sandals or whatnot. But he doesn't care about anything except what he cares about, and he cares about his family, and he cared about his profession. And so he never read a book for pleasure. All he did was read his papers and newspapers and periodicals. And he, his favorite thing to do in the world was to go to academic conferences, which was just crazy. But he was a nerd that way. So, one thing he taught all of us was just, what he loved his work. And we all have sought that kind of joy in our chosen careers, myself and my two sisters. And I think we've found that, thankfully. It wasn't immediate as it was for him, for some of us, but it has gotten there. And, he's always talking about giving back and never settling and never and always giving your very, very, very best. And so all of those lessons I've tried to emulate. I fall short all the time because I don't think there's anybody as dedicated or as passionate as my father and my mother, for that matter, in their chosen careers. My mom was a social worker, and she's still doing social work related work. She raised us, but she also helped support the family through my father's, gallivanting around getting degrees. So she always had secretarial positions and stuff like that. And she was the sole breadwinner for the period of time we were at University of New Mexico. And then when we came to Denton, she continued to work in secretarial capacities until she was ready to go back to school. She had a little bit of schooling postgraduate. She had taken some freshman year classes before she married my dad. And then this is the amazing thing. I mean, my mom, she is able to focus better than anybody I've known. And when my dad got a Fulbright scholarship when I was in high school, and we went down to Mexico for 6 months in Mexico City, where he worked at a couple of the universities as part of that Fulbright program. And when we moved back to Denton, it was I was about to start my junior year of high school, and so we got back that August, and she enrolled at Texas Women's University. And by the time I had graduated high school, she had finished her bachelor's and a master's. So she was a machine. And so she got a master's of social work. She became a school social worker. She ended up getting a second master's at UTA. And she was a school social worker for Denton schools for about 15, 20 years before she retired. Again, tremendous passion and care for the community and for the underprivileged, and just always finding ways to help people. So that's something to live up to when you're a child in this family and a grandchild in this family. And all of us have been, try to emulate that every day.
Well, I think you're well on your way. I know that it's hard to observe what you do, but the amount of people that I'm sure you touched with your kindness and your empathy during such difficult times is just one of many examples of how you're carrying on what your parents taught you, and that passion and that flow and the thing that you described about your dad that allowed him to just really, love what he did. I think that helps you separate from the emotion of every moment, right? That it allows you to have that conversation focused on the person's emotion that you're talking to, not your own emotion, which is really your job in that moment, not indulging your own feeling sorry for yourself because you're having to have the hard conversation. So, I think I know how proud they must be. And they were honored, right, with the naming of a school
Right.
for them. Talk a bit about that. Yeah.
Sure. Well, my father was on the school board in Denton for a few years. First he went from TWU to North Texas for the last 5 years of his career. And then he retired, and then he continued involved in the community. And then he ran for school board, and he got on the school board, and he loved that. And he's continued to be involved in community school-related projects and other things. They are tremendously honored, but by the fact that a few years ago, I can't remember the year anymore, it's at least 4 years ago, I think, that my parents were given the honor of having a school named after them there in Denton, Denton ISD, the Rudy and Rosemary Rodriguez Middle School. And they are the most active named persons in the school I've ever seen. And they go to basketball games at that school. They go to end of year parties. They send goodies to the teachers. They take that thing seriously. They really love it, and it's a beautiful school there in Little Elm area.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. So they knew that my dad was under consideration as having a school named after him. There was some folks working on it, and so we were all very hopeful that it would come through. But on the day after the school board had met, one of the trustees called my father and said, well, Rudy, it's good news. We have agreed to name the school the Rudy and Rosemary Rodriguez School. And my mom was listening on speaker, and she said, "What?" She was stunned, but she deserved it just as much. As I said, she was very involved in Denton School. She was at the DISD school social worker for a while. And so it was just a fantastic honor, and it's so fitting. And they, there's nothing that gives me more pride that their community has recognized them for all the work they put into it.
No, it's so cool. You and I both definitely won the parent lottery. And mine unfortunately passed away before they could totally enjoy it. But their name is on the Vogel Alcove School, and your father-in-law was tremendously impactful in some of the stuff that my family has done to make the community better. I want to get to Daryl in a minute, but I want to deviate a second to, one of the things I saw when I was doing my research is, your love of some great speeches and leaders. And I assume you're a reader of history to this day, but what are some things as you look back? I know the whole story of, we probably don't have time to get into wanted to be a doctor, didn't really like it.
Yeah.
You and your dad had a conversation after A&M, and basically he convinced you to apply to Harvard Law. Great stories. Don't want to cut over them. I might have to have a part two. But talk a little bit about how you apply lessons of history or the way great leaders spoke and delivered important ideas. How do you apply that in your life?
Well, I do try to study leadership, and I've always, when you talked about your dad having a huge Teddy Roosevelt collection, he's one of my favorites. Of course, he's a lot of people's favorites. I don't know why it is, but as a kid, I was always fascinated with presidents, and so I would read a lot of presidential biographies. And then I continued that and getting into more in-depth presidential study as I got older, and even since I've been a professional, that's kind of my favorite type of historical study, at least up until through the 60s or so. It's actually through the 70s, because I've got to say I'm about as fascinated and interested in the Nixon administration as I am in any other, for different reasons, but it's just so interesting. But I don't know. I think that I read, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book a couple of years ago called Leadership, in which she focused on several presidents and their styles. Yeah. And it was interesting to hear, the various ways that, and Teddy was one of them, I think. Teddy, Franklin, and LBJ.
Yeah.
Right. I've always loved LBJ. I always had my father loved LBJ because of what he did for education, and for bilingual education in particular. So he gave me that love of LBJ, and despite all of his flaws, the man was interesting as hell, and did so many good things as well. So I just like the different kinds of leadership, and I try to figure out the kind of leader that I want to be. And since I've been in the business world, studying different kinds of leadership as well in the business context, it's obviously very different in some respects. And so I just, there's not one thing, but I do try to model empathetic leadership. I try to model, emotional intelligence and understanding where people are coming from, what they're feeling. And, one of the things as being an in-house lawyer, even before I was a general counsel, was understanding where my colleagues at the law firms were. The folks I was working with, the associates who were working on the cases with me or for me. And because, I was a young associate too, and I know I never forget what that was like, good and bad. And I always try to put myself in their place, and also to be very appreciative of the work they do when they do good work. And most of the time that's the case. And so I think that that's helped me in my relationships with my outside counsel, that I really am attentive to the associates and the young partners, that I'm always working on, helping folks advance their careers, because I know that I have the ability to make an influence, to have an influence on people succeeding. If they want to stay at a law firm, then more power to them. I want to help them, advance as far as they can, to the extent I can.
So it's a great topic. And I, probably done close to 30 podcasts at this point, and I really started doing it because I thought, I want these for my kids to see, like, these great people and how different people take different paths. But you've been around so many people who taught you and taught me, Daryl and Buster Hughes, and people, I remember Daryl Jordan sitting me down in his office, like wanting to understand who I was at so many different levels, which gave me, I didn't realize it at the time, his little secret sauce clearly was, if he knew me as a person, he could better help guide me as I had issues come up. And so I would frequently go to his office to ask, for advice. But what would you tell young lawyers who would love, if they're working with you, maybe if they're not, to benefit from connecting with you? How do they bridge the gap, not just with Rudy Rodriguez, but any general counsel who, feels so unattainable, so high up in the hierarchy of the way they see things? Like, how would you go about starting those conversations so you could create mentors?
Wow. Well, it's gonna depend a lot on who the GC is, because I've worked for 2-3 general counsel of humongous companies, Ann McNamara and Gary Kennedy at AMR, American Airlines, and Janet Dillon at JCPenney. And they're a very different kind of GC than I am, because of necessity. They had legal teams of over 40 lawyers and, twice that in staff. I have one lawyer, one paralegal right now in terms of my legal department. And we are all a team that just kind of everybody does everything. So it's not as much of it's a different kind of role. I think that you have a lot better chance to get to know and work with closely a GC like me, who's involved directly in managing litigation or transactions, than at a IBM or Microsoft. You're going to be working with, at best, an associate general counsel at the highest level when you're outside counsel. And most of the cases or most of the work that you're doing is going to be with staff attorneys, senior attorneys who are not general counsel level. So I would say that for young or mid-level associates, the best bet in terms of getting to know general counsel is to work on matters for small companies with small legal departments and not very many inside lawyers, because those are the GCs who are going to be more accessible and more involved day to day in almost everything. Of course, there's going to be huge transactions, huge litigation where GCs of big companies get involved as well. but most people don't do that kind of work every day. That's just not standard. So in terms of getting to know folks who have reached leadership in their companies, it's going to be a better bet to go to work on matters for smaller companies with smaller legal departments.
And how would they crack the ice if they did work on one of your matters? Think of a lawyer who might have worked on the CEC bankruptcy and,
right.
Big team of lawyers.
There were so many different lawyers involved, and there's still a tail on that thing. It's not over yet. I just similarly their senior partners are not the ones doing most of the work, and so I'm working with associates from mid-level to senior associate. And in fact, a huge amount of the work that we did. That I did personally involved the real estate and the amending of leases and getting new deals with our landlords and changing lease terms. And the vast bulk of that work was done by a first-year lawyer at Weil, who was this young woman in New York. I still haven't met face to face, but I talked to her or emailed with her probably more than any single lawyer in the bankruptcy day to day, because there was something going on all the time, and she was fantastic. And it was just a matter of I knew that she was working really, really hard at all hours, and it just came. She never tried to talk about anything personal or anything. It was just to me to kind of acknowledge her work and appreciate her, and also in front of her, supervisors and the partners who were watching her work, and talk about her, the quality of her work whenever I could, so that she would get the kudos she deserved internally. When I was in the law firm, I would, in my second time through a law firm, when I worked at Godwin Gruber and Gruber Hurst, it would be, at that point I was in the business development business as well. And so for the work that I was doing, I would invite folks out to lunch, or I would go out to visit at their offices, try to make a personal connection just beyond just what was the task on the lawsuit I was working on.
Yeah. Is that what you look for? Somebody who, people use military references on things like this, but, somebody you can get in the foxhole with, who they are, they're pressure tested, they can empathize with your challenges, both internally and externally, or anything I missed, or there are other things you're looking for in outside counsel?
Just generally responsiveness and quality of work, and kind of anticipating issues before they arise. I remember on the law firm side being told you need to manage your client's expectations, and that's very true. The last thing you want to see happen is a surprise.
Yeah.
And so if you're worried about whether a motion's going to fail, then you better share that pretty quickly with your in-house counsel, so that they can be prepared for that, or make a decision on whether settlement discussions are prudent to go into at this point, or something along those lines, because we're trying to manage our own clients' expectations internally, and everything we do costs money. And especially now in an inflationary environment, we lawyers can't be, wasting money.
Right.
So we're very cognizant of that, and we just need partnership in our dealings with our own clients to help us manage their expectations and support the business the best we can.
Shifting gears a bit, as a lawyer who loves his profession, I happen to know that to be the case with you. And you come from a line of folks. I mean, there's nobody prouder to be a lawyer than your father-in-law.
That's right.
And if you were talking to Jimmy and Grace and they decided to be lawyers, or if you were talking to my kids and they wanted to be lawyers, my Ben, who is going to law school and starting in a couple of weeks. What is there a book you've read? Is there something that you've thought about that helps frame the practice of law in a way that allows you to love it, that allows you to not get ground down and not enjoy what you do or just do it to make money? Any tips for how to love what you do?
Well, and my own kids right now are not in law school or thinking about. I know my daughter's not the least bit interested in it. My son may be down the line, but he's about to start work in a month or so at Accenture himself and try out the business world for a while. But he may at some point go into it. And one of the reasons he might is because he has had good experiences getting to, well, obviously he has seen his grandfather, who's one of the best there ever was. And he did a community service internship with Don Glendenning over at Locke. And Don is involved in all kinds of amazing charitable endeavors. And he had Jimmy do some work on some of his charities. And he's gotten to know Paul Janender over at Weil very well. And just really great examples of lawyers who are equally passionate about the law and the community. All three of those that I'm talking about. And so I think that part of why I love being a lawyer is because of what it enables me to do for the community and for the people who I care about. But day to day, the work that I do is tremendously rewarding and satisfying because of the high level of, strategic thinking, problem solving that it requires. And you do have to spend a lot of time to get to the place where you're feeling that kind of satisfaction every day. But once you do, you're very glad for the training you've received and the hours you've put into it, because it helps you be more responsive and more effective in the community and as an attorney to your client.
Yeah. It sounds, to me, you've been given the gift of having a tool to help people. And that can kind of be a why as a lawyer, is to use that tool for the benefit of others, not just corporates, but individuals as well. I mean, I'm sure it's the same for you. Some of my most satisfying cases were not the most remunerative. So I know we need to wrap up. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate this. Not surprising. It was a fascinating conversation that leaves me wanting to ask you a million more questions, but maybe we'll get to a part two. But I'm sure people listening will have some great takeaways. We didn't even get to U2 or the baseball. I would love baseball or anything like that. So
I really appreciate it. The hour did fly. I appreciate your reaching out, and I hope that folks find this a little bit interesting, but I certainly did enjoy talking to you, Craig, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Rudy. Love to Stacy and the kids.
All right. You take care. Bye-bye. Say hi to Don. Bye-bye.
I will.